get started. So I'm going to share my screen here and get this presentation going. Okay, let's do slideshow. Okay, so again, like I said, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be discussing choosing the right reserve study and adequacy. For those of you who don't know, my name is Brandon Femia. I am the reserve study manager at Kipcon. I don't do every reserve study that we do, but I am involved either way in reviewing all of them, pricing proposals, all that kind of stuff. So I'm in charge of all those that we do here at Kipcon. There are some I don't know if I'd call it exciting, but there are some updates to what's been going on as far as adequacy goes and as far as banking requirements from Fannie and Freddie. So we will be touching on that at the end of this as well. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, let's jump in. So today's webinar will discuss how to choose the right reserve study for your community and develop a reserve funding plan that ensures both adequate funding and minimal risk. Now, adequate can mean many different things to different people, and we're going to kind of jump into that today. This is an advanced level class or a course, I should say. There will be some math, so just try and follow along as best as you guys can. I'll try and break it down as best I can. And of course, if there are any questions, feel free to jump in at the end and we'll clarify whatever it is that those are. So as I said, this is a more advanced session. Please ask questions. There's my buddy Dwight from The Office there, one of my favorite shows. So yeah, just sit back, try and learn something, and hopefully we can help you out here today. So just in general, to start off, real basic level stuff, a reserve study is a budget planning tool that identifies components in a community association is responsible for maintaining or replacing the status of the reserve fund and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future major common area expenditures. So important to note that a reserve study has all of those items in there, and we're going to touch on the 5 parts here in a second. And here's a little flow chart, basically talking about the process from start to finish. And you guys can follow along, establish the components, establish the attributes and conditions, establish the current costs, establish and update the component useful life and remaining lives, establish the project starting fund balance, which is provided to us. And then these next 3 are kind of what we're going to be focusing on the most today. Evaluating and calculating reserve fund strength, establishing and confirming funding methodology and goal, and establish a multi-year funding plan. Those are kind of what the focus of today's webinar is. So that's what we're going to be focusing on over the next hour. And here is kind of a snapshot of, I'm sure everybody has seen something like this before. This is a snapshot from one of our reports. But as mentioned, the 5-part component. So the 5 parts, the component inventory is the first part of this. That's the task of selecting and quantifying the reserve components. Obviously, we want to make sure that we have the correct items in the study, because if we don't, then everything else we do from here on out is irrelevant. So you guys at your associations where you live, where you work, for managers, that's the most important thing. We want to make sure we establish the correct components, we get the correct quantities, because, it's not just as simple as, okay, well, I live in an HOA, so that means the buildings are not part of it. That's really, in general, I would say that that's probably true, but there are so many different combinations of construction and association type that we always want to make sure that we're including the correct things. Before we do anything, we would like to verify all those items, while we're on site. This task can be accomplished through the on-site visual observations, reviewing of the association design and organized documents, reviewing the association precedents, and discussion with appropriate representatives of the association. So again, kind of just what I mentioned. So again, component inventory number 1. Next would be the condition assessment. So condition assessment would be the task of evaluating the current condition of the components based on observed or reported characteristics. So it's all reserve study observations are cursory. They are non-invasive. So we're not taking off any walls. We're not doing any moisture testing. We're not doing any of that stuff as part of a reserve study. Of course, the reserve study may lead to that work in a subsequent project, but as part of the actual reserve study inspections itself, it's all cursory in nature. So, condition can, it kind of is in the eye of the beholder, to be honest with you. Now, of course, we want to make sure that we are as accurate as possible, but the more information that we can be provided, the better. As far as when was this component last replaced? Do you have plans to replace this component? Have there been, problems, leaks, whatever you want to call it? All those things, if associations know, are important to let the engineer know so that we can kind of use those to base our evaluations on. Because there are certain components, a roof is a good example. I mean, you could look at a roof and it may look like it's okay just from the naked eye, but there are a lot of leaks and it's 20 years old. So in that case, it might be time to think about replacing those items. So there are always multiple factors that should go into remaining life. It shouldn't just be, hey, this is this old, okay, so it should be replaced in year X. There are so many factors that go into it, and we like to make sure we account for all those as well, as should any engineer. So that's condition assessment. Next, the life and valuation estimates. So the useful life and remaining useful life, useful life is basically saying when this component is new, it should be expected to last about this long. Now, it's not an exact science, of course. Sometimes using pavement as an example, sometimes your pavement may only last 15 years. Sometimes maybe it'll last 25 years. But on average, 20 years is kind of like the industry standard as far as how long asphalt pavement should last. And then the remaining life aspect of that is basically taking the condition into account that we just talked about and saying, okay, this is how long we think this component will last until it needs to be replaced next. Again, this is a budgetary tool. It's not an exact science, but we like to use as much information as possible to come up with the best as educated guess, I guess you'd call it, as far as when the replacement should occur. Next is what's called fund status. So obviously, there are two aspects of the reserve study. There's the physical aspect of it as far as inspecting the components, but there's also a financial aspect of it as far as, okay, this is how much we need to be setting aside each month or each year to be able to fund these components. So the fund status in particular is the ratio at a particular point in time clearly identified as either the beginning or end of the association's fiscal year, of the actual projected reserve fund balance to the fully funded balance expressed as a percentage. So you can see, just using this example here, as far as what this association has, they have $7,400 for these components, and the full funding balance says that they should have, in a 100% fully funded, perfect pie in the sky world, $11,400. Now, we're going to get into that a little bit because, and I'm sure most managers, if there are managers on here, they will tell you the same thing. We do hundreds of these reports a year, and we can count on one hand probably the amount of associations that are actually 100% fully funded, because most of the time, if not all of the time, fully funded is overfunding. And we're going to kind of get into that a little bit here. But when we talk about fund status, that's what we're talking about. Essentially, how much money you have versus what the full funding balance is at that point in time. So, of course, these are all based on year one. Our component schedule is based on the current year. So at this point in time, 65% funded, which is actually a pretty good percentage. And then funding plan is the last part here. An association's plan to provide income to a reserve fund to offset anticipated expenditures from that fund. The plan must be a minimum of 30 years of projected income and expenses. There's a ton of things that go into this. When you really break it down to the nitty gritty, the reserve fund and the reserve contribution, what it's meant to do is to prevent a special assessment. That's really what it is. You want to fund enough money monthly, annually, however you want to collect it, so that when the time comes to replace component A, B, or C, you have the money and you don't need to ask your residents to write a check. That's really what it boils down to. Now, obviously, there are tons of intricacies to it, but that's really what, the main part of this is. We want to prevent special assessments, and that's what the reserve fund is meant to do. So here are the five that we just talked about. There are 4 levels of reserve studies. So quickly, a level 1 is essentially starting from scratch. Those are done either in a new community or when there is a lack of confidence in the existing study. Obviously, we've done plenty of studies where communities are 10, 20, 30 years old and they never had a study done. So that obviously applies as well. But essentially, a level 1 study is starting from scratch and not having any prior update to base it on. So you can see the 5 items that we just talked about: component inventory, condition assessment, life and valuation estimates, fund status, funding plan. Those are all included in the level 1 study. So level 2 is what's considered a reserve study update. And with level 2, that also includes a site visit. So again, the level 2 studies also include all 5 items that we just talked about. But keep in mind that with an update, typically the standard is that you're using the quantities that have already been established in the prior study. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't add things. It doesn't mean we can't tweak things. But essentially what it's saying is we're not going to fully remeasure every single quantity because it's already been accepted that those quantities and components are accurate. So that's essentially the main difference between a level 2 and a level 1 is essentially just the time to come up with the component inventory and the time to measure the quantities. And when updates are needed. So obviously there are statutory requirements. Assuming most people here today are in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, as of 2 years ago, there is a law now that is in place that says you need to have your reserve study done every 5 years. Period. No questions asked. No wiggle room. That it's written in stone. So that's kind of what's required now. And again, we will touch on Fannie and Freddie in a little bit. But now for condo associations, this is not just New Jersey, this is nationwide. Condo associations will now be, I guess required is not the right word, but recommended to get an update done every 3 years if they want to be able to qualify for Fannie and Freddie mortgages. So we will get to that in a little bit here, but just wanted to throw that out there. And some other times when that's needed, maybe an association doesn't like their funding plan anymore. They want to adjust. The reserve study preparer recommendation recommends that you should get your study done every 3 years. Again, the best practices for CAI say you should get an update every 3. In New Jersey, the statutory requirement is every 5. So typically that's the recommended window, anywhere between 3 and 5 years. So there's also what's called a update without a site visit, or a level 3 update. At Kipcon, we refer to it as a paper update. Essentially, what a paper update is we do not go to the site and do a site visit whatsoever. So essentially, we would just take the prior study, we would subtract however many years it's been on any of the components, we would update the pricing, and we would reissue the report. Now, obviously, if we were told that, replacements were done in that time, we would take that into account as well. But there is no condition assessment involved in that, and there are no component, we're not assessing the components at all. We're just taking what was done previously, subtracting X years, and issuing a new report. So keep in mind, in New Jersey, as part of that 5-year requirement for updates, a paper update does not count towards that. So associations are more than welcome to get paper updates or level 3 updates done, but they do not count towards the 5-year update window. So you would still need to get a reserve study update with a site visit in that 5-year period. Then there's what's called a level 4 study. Essentially, level 4 studies are for preliminary communities or communities that are under construction or not yet built yet. Those studies are simply based on information such as architectural and engineering plans and governing documents. So, that is typically required, speaking in New Jersey specifically, anytime a new community is built, communities are required now to have an initial reserve study included in their budget to submit to submit with their documents. So that's for new construction, yeah, so that's kind of the fourth level of funding. Fourth level of studies. Also, obviously, there's hybrids. Maybe a community comes to us and says, "Hey, we're only comfortable with half of these component quantities. Let's make sure we measure the other half." Obviously, that can be done. So there are always exceptions to the rule, but in general, the four types that we just spoke about are what we see 99% of the time. Okay, so updating. To keep the reserve study current and reflect the ongoing changes to components and the financial needs of the community, the reserve study should be updated and on a regular basis. Best practices is for a site inspection based reserve study at least every third year. Again, there's a lot of moving parts to this because there's CAI best practices, there are statutory requirements, which in New Jersey are 5 years, and now there are banking requirements. So a lot of moving parts going on, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit moving forward. So as far as the national standards for CAI, adequacy, and we talked about adequacy earlier, and that's kind of the main basis of this webinar. So based on the national standards, a replacement reserve funding plan and stable and equitable multi-year funding plan that together provide for the reliable and timely execution of the association's major repair and replacement projects as defined herein without reliance on additional supplemental funding. So that's kind of what I talked about earlier, as far as you want to have a funding plan that doesn't require an assessment. And that's kind of what it breaks down to. Now, keep in mind that does not always mean baseline funding. Baseline funding is, by definition, as far as the state is concerned, baseline funding is adequacy, or I guess more accurately, $1 above baseline funding. But the banking requirements are now different, which again, we'll get to that. But so just keep that in mind. Adequacy does not always mean baseline. So this is based, so New Jersey, this is based on the New Jersey legislation, essentially basically saying that you need to get a reserve study done and it needs to be updated every 5 years. So, I'm sure everyone has probably seen this or talked about this in their associations. But yeah, so again, we have CAI standards, we have New Jersey legislation, and now there are a number of things to consider as far as your association is concerned. I get asked all the time, multiple times a week, well, where should we be? What percentage should we be at? What should we be funding? And there is no blanket answer, unfortunately. There are so many different computations of associations. You've got condominium construction, you've got multifamily construction, you've got townhomes, you've got single family homes, you've got communities that have clubhouses and some don't have clubhouses. You've got communities that have amenities, some don't have amenities, and everything in between. So there's not really a correct answer as far as where should we be. And that's kind of what this slide is kind of talking about here. There are just so many things to consider. Number one is the age of your community. Obviously, if you're a newer community, that's been built in the last 5, 6, 7 years, you kind of have a little bit of time. Chances are you're not going to have any major replacement work due for at least 10 years. Pavement or roofing. So you kind of have time to build up to where you need to be. But if you're a community that's 30 years old and you've never had a reserve done and you've never replaced your pavement or roofing, obviously you can see that example is a lot more negative, I guess. I didn't want to use the word dire, but it kind of is. So there's just so many different things to factor in. And that's why I said we always like to review historical information. What's been done, what hasn't been done. Has there been maintenance done on components? Has there not? Have you replaced some things? Have you not? That's why at the end of the day, yes, your engineer is who's preparing your reserve study, but you as communities, whether it's a board, a resident, a manager, you guys are the ones that are there and working on this and seeing this every single day. So that's why I always like to say it is a collaborative process, because the more information that's provided, the better. So again, and type of building. Obviously, things are going to be a lot different in a 50-story high rise than they would be in a flat homeowners association with no amenities. There's a lot of differences there. So it's not just one flat set of requirements across the board. Your operating budget, obviously, there are certain instances where associations will fund certain items that may typically be a reserve item, but they're funding it through their operating budget. And that's acceptable. As long as it's disclosed somewhere and we can call it out, then that's totally fine. A good example of that is concrete. I know a lot of larger single family associations, they may just have a line item in their operating budget for concrete. They replace, I don't know, whatever, $5,000, $10,000 a year in concrete. They pay it through their operating. Totally acceptable. But we would need to know that so that we don't include it in the reserve study as well, because we want to make sure we're not double funding for these things. That's important. Some other things to consider, inflationary aspects. At Kipcon, we ask associations, do they want to include inflation or interest? Now, with the requirements that are, you need to get your study updated every 5 years at max, is it necessary to include these things? Many times it's not, and many times it's overkill. So that's why it's another important thing to consider in the discussion in preparing the report. Okay, so we got a couple case studies here that we're going to jump into. We're going to get a little bit into the weeds here with numbers. I promise I'll try and break it down as best I can. So just try and follow along. Number one, so this building and these are actual projects that we've done. So this building is a 3-story building. It's 11 units. It's 10 years old. So the prior study that was done was 12 years ago from the POS. So that was a level 4 study that was initially done during construction. So essentially, this is the first study that this community has had as an existing building. So just keep that in mind. So again, a snapshot of their summary chart here. Not terribly important, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea. The most important things to look at are they have 575,000, and what this number represents is if the association wanted to remove and replace all of their common elements at the same time, that would be what it estimated would cost. Obviously, there are certain things that over 30 years may require replacement multiple times, carpeting or lighting or whatever the case may be. But this is saying if you wanted to remove and replace everything one time, it would be about $575K. That's the most important thing to note as of now. So this is a snapshot of what their current funding contribution looks like over 30 years. So you can see, which is kind of what I talked about earlier, since they're a newer building, over the first 5-10 years, they're okay. And then that's when we start to see the expenditures hit. And then that's when you can start to see the money start to dwindle and even go negative in about 16 years, whatever that is, 15 years. So basically this is saying if the association were to continue funding at their current level for the next 30 years, this is what would happen to their fund balance. They drop to, negative $250,000, $260,000 in the future, which is obviously not something we want to recommend. This is the same graph, but essentially we've now imported in full funding recommendations and baseline funding recommendations. So you can see the green in the middle is baseline funding. What baseline funding does is it allows the fund balance to drop to 0 in one of the corresponding 30 years. So you can see that in 2045 here, we do drop to 0, but essentially, as per the New Jersey legislation, this green line funding would be acceptable. Now, the blue line is full funding. What we talked about earlier as far as full funding being overkill, and the reason for that is you can see that this number, this line just keeps going up and up and up, 400, 500, almost $600,000. And then even past that, we go well above that. Now, of course, would it be great to have that much money in your fund? Yes, of course. But is it really necessary? So that's why we typically say that full funding is overkill, because while it is the pie in the sky goal, I guess you'd call it, it's not really something that you need to aspire to get to. So typically most associations that we deal with are somewhere in this range, and you can see the line here, somewhere between baseline and full. Now, some associations may choose to be more risk averse and they're higher to the full funding line. Some associations may be okay with taking some risk and they're, somewhere down here maybe. But as long as you're somewhere between those, you're typically considered okay. So I just wanted to, it's kind of a good, illustrative view to take a look at this. And here are the numbers that correspond to what we were just looking at. So quickly, we've got current funding. This is what we were just looking at, which would be this red line here. So you can see that in 2042 is when we drop to a deficit. So we dropped to $185,000 in the hole. So you can see that you have some time to kind of catch up to where you need to be. Full funding, which was the top line in the prior graph, showing is about $45,000 per year. And then baseline funding, which was the middle line in the previous graph, was $29,000 per year, almost 30. So they're at 20. They need to get to 29.9. Not that crazy. So, basically what we can do now is kind of do some, trial and error calculations. So the cost of the most expensive component in the previous example, $133,000. A lot of times communities use that as kind of a threshold and say, okay, we need to make sure we have at least this much money so that, God forbid, if this fails, we can pay for it. Now, this study does include inflation. Again, whether you want to include inflation and interest as well, that's up to each individual association. Typically, it's not... we do include it as a standard, but many times it's not necessary, especially now with updates being needed every few years. So just keep that in mind. So $133, that's one, example of a minimum threshold. We want to make sure we keep at least that in our fund. Or the other thing people do many times is a percentage of the total replacement cost dollars. So if you remember a couple minutes ago, we were talking about this chart here, the 575K, as far as how much money is needed for replacement of everything. So we'll go back here and we'll say, okay, that's the number that we will take the percentage of. So in the industry, many times people ask for 5% threshold or 10% threshold, which is very common. When we're talking that, usually what we mean is of this number. So you can see that 10% of this number is 57,000 and 5% is 28,000. And what we're saying is we're okay with allowing our reserve fund to drop to at least these numbers as a minimum. So 57K or 28K. Again, just want to make it clear, there is no right or wrong answer. There is no, you don't have to follow a certain percentage. There's no, there's no number exactly that you have to follow. There are so many different options and so many different answers to get to where you need to go. These are just some ones that we typically see. So in this instance, the client had told us, okay, let's try a funding scenario where we don't go up by more than 10%. We're going to update our funding every 3 years. And, as we talked about earlier, they had a line item in their budget for brick repointing, and we had it in the reserve study. So again, in this instance, this component really does not need to be in the reserve study because they're funding it elsewhere in their budget. So really what we should do in this instance is just leave it here, put a 0, and then put a footnote that says the brick is being funded elsewhere in the budget. So those are kind of some things that we dealt with as far as, in our communication with the association. So now we're going to get into some nitty gritty here. So as we saw, the current contribution of this association was $20,000 a year. If they were to continue on that level, they would drop to a deficit in 2044 and an ultimate deficit of $286,000 in the hole by 2054. Obviously, we know that associations are not going to continue their same contribution for 30 years, but just for sake of argument, we're showing that they could not sustain that and be cash positive. So Full funding, in this instance, the annual contribution was $45,000 a year. In full funding, the least amount of money that they would have over the 30 years would be $171,000. So you can see that that's a pretty hefty cushion, if you want to call it that. And then baseline funding, they were putting away $29,000 a year with a minimum threshold of 0. So again, that is risky. Baseline funding is risky. Don't want to cloud that, because if a project costs a couple $100 more than you thought, you would run out of money essentially. I'm being dramatic there, but it's basically saying that we're only dropping to 0, and anything outside of what the reserve study says, we're going to run out of money. And again, in this instance, we were using initially 1% interest and 2% inflation, and the question is that needed? So this is again what we were looking at earlier: 20,000 a year for current, 45,000 a year for full, and 29,000 a year for baseline. And now we're going to show, again, this is the same graph as previously, but now we're going to start doing some kind of trial and error here. So first thing was we're going to take interest out. In discussions with the client, that was what the determination was. We only included inflation for components requiring replacement within the first 3 years. So again, is that a major thing for 3 years? No, it's not. And honestly, I would probably in this instance recommend the association not use inflation at all. But that's just what we came up with. We decided to try a yearly increase of 3%. So starting at 20,000 a year, which way they were doing, going up by 3% a year moving forward over the next 30 years. So in that instance, the threshold, the minimum balance that they would have in that example was $118,000. And that is based on the size of the building, based on the number of units, that's a pretty decent cushion. So we'll see on the next slide here. They are moving, they started at the 20,000 a year. We're going up 3% a year. And you can see that, it's a gradual increase, and 3% is not crazy. We're kind of seeing that as cost of living increases each year anyway. But you can see that they have a decent amount of money all the way down the line, over $100,000 in every single year. So the determination was that the association would like to stick to that funding method. And again, this is not, hey, this is the only answer. There are multiple ways to skin a cat. Let's say they wanted to do 6% every 2 years. Obviously, it's not exactly the same, but for sake of argument, it is. So there are many ways to go about it. It's all based on what your association is comfortable with and what they want to do, and what they, you guys know your residents better than we do. So that's why a discussion is very important once the draft report is issued. Okay, so this case study number 2, a little bit more extreme. This building is also 11 stories, a lot larger, 181 units, 63 years old. This is also a full study. So you can see that going back to what we were looking at earlier, they now have $5.6 million if they needed to remove and replace everything one time. So a lot different than the 500,000 we were just dealing with in the last instance. So contributions per year, you can see they were not doing too well at this place. They were putting away. I don't know if it was a down year. They need money for other things, but the contribution was way, way, way low. So you can kind of see that the different funding methods there are extremely higher than what they needed to be. Just an illustrative version of the graph here, you can see they get down to almost negative $20 million by the end of this. Same graph we showed earlier, with full funding up top and baseline funding in the middle. Again, we want to ultimately be somewhere in this range here, somewhere between baseline and full. So yeah, so this is kind of showing this in a table format. Not a good situation, essentially what was happening here. So now we start on our trial and error process. $800,000 in this instance was the cost of the largest item, and that's in current dollars. In inflated dollars, that was 1.2 million, as you can see. So the first determination was, let's take interest and inflation out and see where we fall. And that's kind of what I do and what most of our project managers do. Let's take that out first and kind of see where we are, and then maybe we go from there. And then in this instance, like we talked about, 5.6 million to replace everything. And so essentially taking percentages of that, you can see 562K is 10% and 281K is 5%. So those are just some ballpark thresholds to kind of keep in mind as we work through this. So we had conversation. Let's try maximum increases of 10% per year with an update of every 3 years. It's a high-rise building, so unseen components. What we usually do for high-rises is we include a percentage of the overall dollars for unseen contingency, is what we call it. Typically, that would include things like wiring, piping, plumbing risers, things that are behind the wall that we can't really inspect, but we know that they're, number one, will need to be replaced at some point, and number two, are very expensive typically. So we want to make sure we're accounting at least some money for those things. So basically what happened was the association said, okay, we're going to start, instead of 10, let's just assume we're at $100,000 moving forward as far as annual contributions, because I think it was a down year. They had to pay for some other things, whatever the case may be. So we started out with 100K as far as annual contributions instead of the 10s. That they were in a little bit better shape. If that deficit were to continue, if that contribution were to continue, they would be in the hole almost $1 million by 2038 and over $13 million by 2054. So again, not a good situation. And then with full funding in that instance, we would have 611K, but the minimum that they'd have in their fund, the least amount of money that they'd have in their fund over 30 years is over $3 million. So you can see how with full funding, I mean, why do we need to have all that money in our account? Yes, it's great. Everybody would love to have it, but it's not necessary. So just keep that in mind. And then with baseline funding, $479,000 a year, where we would also allow the fund to drop to zero. So you can see there's between this number and this number, you have almost $150,000 difference on an annual basis, which is obviously huge. So here we go with the process. This is just kind of illustrating what we just talked about, 100K a year. We're at 611 full and 479 baseline. So we want to end up somewhere between those two numbers, essentially. And here is the graph illustrating what we just saw. So now, okay, so we're going to start continue the trial and error process, I should say. We're going to take interest and inflation out except for items within the first few years. So that's something that we do initially. Let's start with a maximum yearly increase of 10%. If we do that, 10% a year increases moving forward, what does the threshold become? So in that instance, doing that example, we would still have a deficit of over $1 million in 2039. So of course, that is not acceptable. So we kind of have to try out some other things. So in that instance, here we go. You can see, they're okay for a good, 10, 12 years, but then we drop off a cliff again. So not acceptable. So that funding plan is out. Number two. So this is the second option. So again, we're taking interest out, inflation only for a few years, and then we're going to determine the maximum yearly increase at 10%. So 10% of the overall dollars, which we talked about earlier, is $562,000. So if we wanted to keep $562,000 as a minimum, what we would need is increasing by 11% per year. So if we were to increase by 11% per year, every year moving forward, we would have at minimum always above $542,000 in our fund. So you can see that is pretty close. Again, this is never going to be exact, but you're within $20,000 of where your anticipated 10% number was. So we can kind of look at that. That would be acceptable technically. Option two. So we're going to, again, remove interest, only include inflation for items that are in the next 3 years, And then we're going to try, all right, let's say, well, let's try 2% a year moving forward. Essentially, what we did was we said 2% per year for 7 years, and then we went from 2% to 16% a year after that. In those instances, we were left with 336K. So, over the next few years, they're only at 2%, but then after that, the increases get higher. But that allows you to at least work towards where you need to be. It's not as drastic of a jump. So, you can see that the option one, this is the first one we talked about. This is going up 11% every year all the way down. Now, they get up to over $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, 5, 6, 8, 9, $11 million by the end of this. So while this scenario works, is it really necessary to increase by that much? Again, this would be acceptable, but a board may say, "Hey, you know what? We don't want to go up by that much, so let's try something else." And this is kind of what it is. In graphical format, you can see 11% per year. It's acceptable, but again, by the time we get out past 5, 6, 7 years, I mean, honestly, in any reserve study, a lot of this is arbitrary. That's why getting your update done every 3, 4, or 5 years is so important because, at this point in time, then we're going to reassess everything and say, okay, you have been doing what you needed to be doing, but let's see where we are moving forward. So in this instance, the association actually did want to go with this and stick with the 11% per year, and then they wanted to reassess after the first 3 or 4 years. So again, that might not be what your association wants to do, but basically the main point of this is there are so many different options that it's important to have a back and forth discussion with your engineer. Okay, so now we're going to move on to what not to do. As I'm sure most of you know, there has been, up until 3 weeks ago, there has been a banking measure of adequacy as far as Fannie and Freddie is concerned. So what Fannie and Freddie have said is that if you don't have a reserve study, which again, I don't recommend that. Nobody recommends that, but just keep that in mind as a point of argument. If you don't have a reserve study, you should then put aside 10% of your overall budget on an annual basis for reserve contribution. So that's what the Fannie and Freddie requirements have been. That 10% has now been bumped up to 15% as part of this new change with Fannie and Freddie. Now, what that means is if you don't have a reserve study, so obviously the fact that we're talking about reserves, and I'm assuming most of your communities have reserves or have had reserves, if you have a reserve study and you're following the funding plan, or at least trying to, this 15% is arbitrary. You don't need to meet that as long as you have a current reserve study that you're funding towards. So it's either one or the other. And of course, if you don't have a reserve study done, you are not in compliance with the New Jersey legislation. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of moving parts to this. It's new for us, just like it is new for you guys as board members and homeowners and management. So just keep that in mind. But in general, the reason not to do that is because what we talked about earlier. Every community is so different. How can you compare a 10-unit, small building to a 500, 50-story building? It's really impossible to do it. There's so many differences. So that's why having one blanket answer for everything is not the way to go about things. So that's why everything we've talked about today with the reserve studies and all the different ways you can go about things is important to keep in mind. So how do you get there? Scope of work in your reserve study. When you're going to request a proposal, whether it be from Kipcon or another engineer, you want to make sure you have a couple different things. Want to make sure we're seeing full and baseline funding. And again, full for condos may not be necessary anymore, but I'm just now speaking in general and not to Fannie and Freddie, which we'll get to in a second. All plans will include estimated inflationary cost. Again, if the board and the association decides that they don't want that or don't need that, that's totally fine. There is nowhere in any legislation that says you have to include inflation and interest in your reserve study. So just keep that in mind. And then obviously down here in red, always try and meet with your engineer. You'd be surprised how many times, we prepare a report, we issue the report, and then we just don't hear anything from the association anymore, which is fine. I mean, but at the end of the day, we want to prepare a report that you can use. So we want to make sure that we spend the time meeting with you and explaining the report to you and all these different things to make sure that you have a report that you can use. So definitely, make sure that you're taking advantage of that. Meet with your engineer, discuss with your engineer, revise the report, and get something that you can use. Yeah, and this is just an example of from our proposal, the things that we ask for. Um, the annual contribution, we'll need to know that just to compare what you're doing to what you should be doing. How much you have in your reserve fund, the effective date of the report, inflation rates and interest rates if you want to use those, your budget, information regarding work that's been performed. So as I mentioned earlier, if since the last update was done, if you've replaced component X, Y, or Z, we should know that. Obviously, we'll probably be able to tell that just from seeing it and coming on site, but it's important to be able to have that information as far as when things were done. And then, a couple other things down there at the bottom that are requested, not as important, but these are kind of the things you should be asking for or be prepared to provide, I guess, when you're doing your reserve study. Okay, so this is kind of the new stuff now that we're going to get into. So changes are on the way or are already starting in lending requirements through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So a couple of points. These changes are only for, at least at the moment, they're only for condos. So if you live in an HOA, none of this applies. Everything that we've talked about is still the same as it has been. So this is only for condo associations. This is also not just New Jersey. So if we have any non-New Jersey people in here, this does apply to you. This is a nationwide change. So now in effect, as of August 3rd, the limited reviews have stopped. So basically, which we'll get into what that means here, but all reviews for mortgages will be full for associations. So there are no quick reviews anymore. There are more stringent guidelines now, and what the main part of that is number one, your reserve study must be no more than 36 months old. So again, going back to what we talked about, Fannie and Freddie now want to see a 3-year-old reserve study. New Jersey in general wants updates every 5. So you as an association kind of have to work out that difference there. There are different time frames and there are different years, but it's just another wrench in this is these banking requirements now. So, and the most important thing probably, associations now must fund to the highest recommended annual contribution amount recommended in the reserve study. So if you have a reserve study done and that reserve study shows full funding, and as we talked about a couple times, full funding is overfunding. It is. I mean, you saw in the examples we had where the associations had hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in their fund when they really didn't need it. But what this is saying is if your reserve study has full funding in it, Fannie and Freddie will hold you to full funding. And if you're not, then you're technically not in compliance. So essentially and I can't speak to all engineers, but what Kipcon has been doing in these instances is simply just removing full funding from our report. As part of the draft, we can certainly show it just to give an example and so associations see it. But when the final report is issued, we simply just remove it altogether from our reports. There is nothing anywhere that says you have to show full funding. And again, this is all ultimately up to each association. But if it were me, that would be my recommendation, is to simply remove full funding so that you cannot possibly be held to that. And the last thing is, another important part of this is, we talked about earlier that technically based on the New Jersey legislation, technically baseline funding or $1 above baseline funding is acceptable. Now, as part of Fannie and Freddie, they are saying that is not acceptable anymore. So you cannot use baseline funding as your long-term funding goal. which basically leaves some sort of threshold that you need to go to. Now, again, people ask how strict are they going to be? Well, what if we're $100 over baseline funding? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. No, we haven't seen, I guess the fruits of that yet because it's so new to everybody. It's new to us as well. But essentially, they are saying that baseline funding is no longer acceptable. And then what's coming in a couple months, as of the start of 2027, the reserve allocation for capital expenditures is being increased from minimum of 10% currently to a minimum of 15% of the overall annual budget. So we talked about that earlier. If you have a reserve study done that's less than 36 months old, this 15% are meaningless, basically. If you're following a less than 3-year-old reserve study, you don't have to worry about the 15%. But that's, again, they're making things more stringent, and it's tough for communities for sure. I mean, we've gotten some complaints about it, but unfortunately, it is what it is, and all we can do is help our associations get to where they need to be. So again, I know there's probably a lot of confusion, a lot of questions about this. It's new. It's new for everybody. You can see it's 3-4 weeks old here, so there's a lot going on. And then some links here to the actual lending letters from Fannie and Freddie. Jen will send everybody the slides when we're done. So if you want to read through these, you certainly can. And yeah, that's the extent of it today. So thank you guys all. Now we're going to open it up to some questions in the chat, I guess.
Okay. Thank you again, everyone. And just to reiterate, I put my email address in the chat. So if you need CEU credits, you can email me. My email is there. And I'll be sending a copy of the presentation. And you can always reply to that email as well for the credits. Okay. So first question from Keith. If you have full funding method, can you use some of those funds in the event of an emergency instead of special assessment for an operational cost, i.e. additional snow removal cost?
So as far as transferring money from your reserve fund, that is an accounting/legal question. So I don't want to say definitively either way. My opinion on the matter is that at the end of the day, it's your money. How you allocate it or how you can move it, that's an accounting and legal question. I don't want to speak to that because that's not my expertise, but I would think that there are ways that you can do that legally somehow. But I don't know 100% for sure. So definitely check in with your accountant and with your lawyer.
Okay. Next question from Glenn. Component replacement costs are not the only expenses incurred by HOAs. How do you include consultant engineering, spec creation, and vendor monitoring, and property management administrative charges?
So for big ticket items, when we're talking big ticket, I'm talking pavement and roofing and siding and decks. What Kipcon does as a practice is we typically would include 6% of the overall total on top for engineering fees, which would incorporate specs and bidding and contract admin. So those would be included in the costs. As far as management fees and that kind of thing, that I don't really know because that's not my cup of tea, honestly. But as far as strictly engineering fees, those are typically accounted for in the replacement costs because they are part of the replacement project, so they should be included.
Next question from Eric. Can or should an associate include annual maintenance contracts, example, boiler maintenance, elevator contracts, in reserves as they are needed for preventive maintenance and not as discretionary as some operating expenses?
Yeah, for sure. So those items can be included in your preventive maintenance for sure. Basically, my thought is, again, going back to what I said previously, we want to make sure that we're not that number one, we're funding for everything somewhere and we're not double funding for things. So if your association chooses to fund things through preventive maintenance or through reserve rather than through operating or vice versa, I think that that's totally acceptable. Obviously discuss it with your management company or your attorney, but I think that that's fine as long at the end of the day, the goal of this is to fund for these things somewhere. So wherever it comes from, I think that that's acceptable.
Um, a two-part question. So Kimberly asked, would you clarify exactly what part of the budget the 15% applies to? Is it only assets? And then Gary in response replied, if we have an existing Kipcon reserve study with full funding noted, can the 15% of annual budget be a fallback instead?
So the 15% is of your overall budget. So your overall annual budget, which obviously incorporates everything from snow removal to landscaping to management fees to all these different things. Whatever that total number is, that's what the 15% number applies to. And the second part of that is yes, if you want to, I guess, supersede the reserve study and just do the 15% number, yeah, as far as I understand it, that is acceptable. Yes.
And then from Robert, the question is whether non-essential safety structural components should be in the reserve study.
Yes. If it's a common element, it should be in the reserve study. Now, there are some I guess things left up to interpretation as far as hey, some associations decide, hey, I'll use an example. This gym equipment was donated. We didn't actually buy it, so we have no plans to replace it. If that's the case, that's understandable. We would probably make note of it somewhere in the report. But at the end of the day, anything that's common really should be in the reserve study. So, like I said, there are things up for interpretation, but in general, yes, any common element should be included.
And then last question in the chat. How do you educate your board treasurer that the reserve study is a guide and not to be used as the Bible on your monthly yearly budget?
It's funny because I say it all the time. I mean, if you read the national standards, it says as such. It is a budgetary tool. It is not an exact science. If it were an exact science, if these things were that if I was able to predict exactly when every expenditure was going to occur, I probably would not be in this industry. I'd be, gambling somewhere else. But no, it's we get that all the time. It is a budgetary tool. It's not an exact science. We do the best that we can. You follow it as best you can, and really that's all you can do. I mean, there are always going to be, no matter who your engineer is, no matter what your company, your association, there are always going to be components that need to be replaced sooner than what the reserve study says, and there are always going to be components that last longer than what the reserve study says. So it's not, nobody can predict the future. I mean, we make our best guess based upon our engineering expertise, industry standards, what we're seeing in the field, that kind of thing. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is a budgetary tool, and it's not meant to be an exact science, just by definition.
Eric snuck in one more question. If preventive maintenance expenses can be in reserve, can all or some of the payroll expense of an association superintendent be in the reserve? He knows it's a bit of a
No,
strange question.
yeah, that would be different. Preventive maintenance is pretty well defined. Reserves are pretty well defined, and that would as far as payroll or paying your management company, no, those would not be typically considered reserve items. No.
Okay. And Keith had a question. My COA is almost fully developed. We are in transition. Am I correct that in New Jersey, a developer must fully fund?
Um, that's a loaded question. Um, so the developer is supposed to fund as per the reserve study, but the initial reserve study, I should say. But if things are not online yet, as an example, if the roads have not been topped yet in your community, then the developer is not responsible for funding those until that happens. The developer is not responsible for funding a building, let's say, roofing or siding or whatever the common element is, until that building is completed and there are CO issued. So in general, I would say yes, but doesn't mean they have to fully fund as per the initial reserve study if things are not completed on the commune, if that makes sense. So really, they only need to fund for things that have been built. Once something is built or has a CO issued, then they need to begin funding for those items. Yes.
Eric just wrote in the chat, but the expense for Kipcon's reserves can be in reserve, so it looks like some human services expenses are in the reserve.
Yeah, so that is part of the legislation. So in New Jersey, as part of the legislation, the reserve study update itself must now be included in the reserve study. Same for the structural inspection. If you have a mid or high rise building or a building with a podium deck or parking garage, your buildings are required to get a structural inspection done now as per the New Jersey legislation. Those items can be in the reserve study, but that is just because that's what the legislation calls for.
Okay. That's it for the chat questions. If anyone wants to unmute and ask, or so if no
Hey,
one has,
I have a question.
Sure.
Mhm.
So the definition of preventative maintenance seems very undefined. So why is it that having the plumber come in can be in the reserve? I'm trying to get for this and future boards the non-discretionary expenses out of the operating. So my current and future board knows that, hey, we need to have money for the boiler maintenance company. And isn't there some, especially if you have like a low pressure boiler, staffing a black seal seems like something that's needed for preventative maintenance and normal operation of the equipment, of the infrastructure.
Yeah, so you're right. Preventive maintenance is a lot more open-ended, unfortunately. The what the legislation says is that there needs to be some accounting for maintenance in the reserve study itself. That's it. It doesn't say how much, what. So you're absolutely right that those are items that should be done. Using your example with a boiler, but there are no items that are required to be done aside from replacing it.
Right. But I think
Unfortunately,
that
I'm with you though.
I think part of the best practices from the CAI is it's missing the fact that if we decide to plant flowers in outside, that seems super discretionary to me.
Sure.
But not funding somebody to daily monitor the boiler.
Yeah, but the problem is best practices is not law.
I
I
guess
agree with what you're saying 100%, but it's not required, unfortunately.
right. So what we got into was this game of musical chairs where boards and owners tried to underfund the reserve in anticipation that they'd move out
Yeah.
before, an $800,000 multiple elevator modernization or $1 million boilers needed to be replaced. And so I guess for me, as a citizen of New Jersey and a resident of a condo, I'd really prefer that the reserve studies have more teeth and be more realistic of what we need to do as responsible stewards with a fiduciary responsibility to the owners to
Sure.
keep the building functioning. And I
Sure.
found in the study, if I and I don't mean to too much of a dig here, but Kipcon was very flexible in changing, was overly I was dissatisfied with the Kipcon study that we got
Okay.
because they were not as aggressive because I think many boards don't want to be aggressive.
Well, I mean, aggressive. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear that, and feel free to reach out to me offline if we can kind of connect and maybe discuss that further. But number two is you're right. Some associations are less aggressive, but at the end of the day, if the funding plan that we recommend and they agree to meets all of these stipulations, even if it's not as aggressive, technically it's in compliance.
But if I
Um,
don't fund the monitoring of my boilers and the boilers blow up, aren't I as a board member personally liable, potentially personally liable, and my D&O insurance most likely won't cover it because it will.
well, if the boiler blows up, that's not typical wear and tear.
No, because I didn't have anybody to maintain it on staff to do the Black Seal monitoring.
100%, yes. That you should have. Again, I'm agreeing with what you're
Yeah,
saying,
yeah,
but
yeah.
unfortunately, there's nowhere that can enforce that. That's at the end of the day, boards and managers have to kind of have some of that as well. So I have no problem. If associations tell us to include maintenance or include inspections and again, just using your example of boilers, I have no
Yeah.
problem with that. It's just not something that's typically a reserve item. But that doesn't mean it can't be a reserve item.
Right, but by not including it, aren't you, if a building had a critical failure, thus exposing the board members to personal liability for that failure?
I mean, if you're funding for it, then no.
Right, right, right. I get that. But if we don't put it in the reserve study, there's no visibility. And, look, the only people with liability in this are board members. Property managers and engineers are not.
I mean, I guess that's true as far as legally. But again, there are funds outside of reserves that are still recommended and or required, but I can only speak to reserves. So,
Brandon, thank you. I don't
yeah, of
mean to take
course.
up, and I will reach out to you by email. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Brandon, doesn't Kipcon have a product for preventive maintenance
We
that you
do.
can add? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we offer preventive maintenance schedule as an option. Again, it's not required, but we do offer that as an option in addition to our reserve studies for sure.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Brandon, hi, this is Denise. One question. What if the board chooses not to comply with any of the regulations you've discussed, the New Jersey, the banking regulations, or the bank in general, any of the regulations? What are the
Um,
repercussions?
well, that's not a good thing, of course. But to be honest, so the reserve study aspect of it's self-governing. There's no reserve study police. There's no you're going to get fined X dollars if you don't do your reserve study. So that, obviously, while I strongly, strongly recommend against that, there's really not a penalty per se. Now, if you have, and the reason I say that is the reserve study, even though there are statutory requirements in the state, the reserve study does not need to be submitted anywhere. Now, the other leg of the legislation, which we kind of touched on briefly, is the structural inspection aspect of it. If your community is a mid or high-rise building and or has a parking garage or podium deck, depending on the construction, you are now required to get a structural inspection done basically every 5 years. If it's a new building, it's 15 years and then every five, but basically, for sake of argument, every 5 years. Those structural inspection reports do have to be submitted to the state. Now, I'm not, that's not my department, so to speak. So if you don't comply with that, I don't really know what happens, quite honestly. I mean, that even that part of it is still new. But as far as the legislation goes, now as far as Fannie and Freddie, really quickly, I mean, again, we don't know for sure what's going to happen, but from what it sounds like, if you are not complying with their recommendations, they may decide not to lend mortgages to people looking to buy in your community. That's what it sounds like, at least. So, of course, that affects the overall resale value. That affects everybody in your community if that happens. So, definitely something to monitor, and I would strongly recommend that these things are adhered to.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. This is Deborah. So are those structural inspections part of the reserve study?
Yes. So, well, I should say yes and no. It is a separate inspection. Just speaking to how Kipcon does it, we have our PEs and or either do the inspection of the report or oversee the inspection of the report, and they don't necessarily are the ones that do the reserve studies. But either way, the structural inspection itself, as in the cost of it, needs to be included in the reserve study, and then any corrective maintenance that is needed immediately. Like, let's say that the structural inspection determines that a column is failing and needs to be dealt with immediately. That corrective maintenance also needs to be included as a line item in the reserve study. So they are related for sure. They don't have to be done exactly at the same time, but they are definitely related.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If no one has any other questions, we'll wrap up today's webinar. Like I said, you can email me at jlaguardia@kipcon.com for your certificates. I'll send out an email with the slides, and then later today, the video will be live on our YouTube channel. And thank you all again for attending.
Thank you very much, guys. If anyone has questions specifically for me, feel free to reach out to myself or Jen, and she can put me in touch. But yeah, thank you guys for your time, and everyone have a great morning.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Brandon.